Hello and welcome back to the International Booker Shortlist Reviews. Today we have another book that I will compare to Fernanda Melchor because it's about women and it's not written in English. And the book we're talking about today is called Crooked Plow. Crooked Plow is a story of two sisters and they both cut up their mouths with a knife and one of them cuts their tongue out. And then, as the book continues, we realize that that didn't matter. So my feelings on this book are complicated, and I really only woke up to what the book was trying to do by the end of the book. But I feel like my criticisms on the book being, like, boring and my lack of interest in it, I think those criticisms still stand, but we'll talk about it, I'm being mean right off the bat, but I should preface this by saying that I don't particularly hate this book. I think it's a little bit annoying, but overall I get why people like it. I understand the appeal of it. It just was not connecting with me even remotely, and there were things that I wish it did that the book just chose not to do, and that was just frustrating me in like an engagement way. So the book has a couple of good hooks at the beginning for the reader. When they start cutting their mouths up with the tongue, one of them cuts their tongue off, and the way the book describes that in sort of a minimalist way was quite disturbing, like how she has her hand up to the mouth to hold whatever it was still in, you know, and I was like, oh, that's quite disturbing. And then the grandmother who had the knife ends up killing herself. And I wouldn't say any of these are spoilers because they happen in the first like 20 pages, but it's a good setup and I was like, oh, this is pretty investing, this is interesting. But my main problem with the book is that 70% of the book doesn't do shit, or when it does do shit, it's the most predictable shit possible. The plot of the book is so standard, and whenever they introduce something, some new kind of plot element, I knew exactly where it would end, and I was completely right every single time. There's a love triangle, and one of the sisters starts to get close with the boy at the beginning, and I said, alright, well the boy is gonna end up with the other sister then, and I was absolutely right. The other sister then starts seeing a man, and the man's a lot older than her, and I went, okay, in a book like this, that man's gonna turn out to be abusive, and I was absolutely right. A woman comes to the house of one of the sisters, the mute sister, and says, help, my husband is abusing me, and I said, alright, the woman is gonna go to the house and threaten the abusive husband with Chekhov's knife, and I was absolutely right again. Every single plot— I'm not a genius, by the way, for figuring these out, and I'm not lying. I did think these things and then they did happen, because they are the most predictable plot beats in even like an English language book. It's just the most obvious possible plot progressions for like, oh, it's a love triangle plot, it's gonna end up like this. Oh, it's an abuse plot line, it's going to end up like this. And I was absolutely right every single fucking time, and I guess that just means that boring writing is universal. There's like nothing to talk about with this book, even though there are points where it makes a decision that could be interesting, and it usually makes the most correct decisions in each scenario. It's like the most boring decisions as well. Like in the second part they start talking about unions, and I just wanted to read more of Mater 210. And then there's some ghost shit that happens, not to spoil, and the ghost shit I just wanted to read like Fernanda Melchor, although not specifically Fernanda Melchor, but stuff like that. This book is the most boring paint-by-numbers version of itself, apart from that opening 20 to 30 pages. And for those of you who would say, well, it's good that the book is predictable because it shows consistency in the plot and it shows consistency in the characters, normally I would agree and I would just say, oh, this book isn't for me, kind of like Stillborn. I'd be like, the book's a bit predictable and boring, but that's just my opinion, it's not for me. But I feel like that doesn't apply with this book because the first 20 to 30 pages are unpredictable and they set up a type of book that isn't delivered. They set up like an interesting, exciting, perhaps violent, perhaps sort of scary book. And then the rest of the book just isn't like that. It's just like the most fucking boring shit. And I know that there's like ghosts and people get possessed and shit, but I just didn't care. It was just not investing to me. And those first 20 to 30 pages were, and they were interesting, and I was like, I can't wait to see how this pays off. I can't wait for this tone to continue. And the tone didn't continue. It was just like boring. When the author shows willingness to be interesting at the beginning and then just autopilots for the rest of the book, it's so fucking frustrating in a way that it wouldn't be if it just didn't set up something interesting or wasn't boring. Ultimately, the tongue-cutting thing doesn't really matter. Of course it is metaphorical. I get the metaphor of it, but with the progression of the book and with the kind of like style of it, the fact that they cut out their tongue in like a very sort of bizarre, disturbing, magic realist sense does not matter. It doesn't matter. Shooting for the fences like that at the beginning of the book isn't integrated properly and feels like cock teasing. It feels like cock teasing. It feels like you're teasing a different kind of book that I would personally enjoy more, not saying that it would necessarily be better. It was either predictable or not doing anything. The plantation shit and the union shit didn't matter until like the end. The abuse stuff didn't matter at all. The love triangle at the beginning didn't matter at all. None of it mattered, and it was like, at the end when you start to understand what the book is trying to do, you go, well, why the fuck was it so boring the rest of the time? I realize that my thoughts on this book aren't any more specific than it was boring, and it's kind of hard to enunciate that other than the fact that it was predictable and I could predict a lot of the plot of it. But my thoughts become more complicated once we get to the third act. So spoilers from here on out. If you're reading this book, don't go into it knowing the twist in part 3, because chances are you're gonna like the book and you're really gonna love that twist. Because I liked the twist, at least initially. So go into it not knowing it. So spoilers from here on out. The first 2 parts are narrated by each of the sisters. The first part is narrated by the sister who doesn't cut her tongue out. The second part is narrated by the girl who does cut her tongue out, and she's mute. The third part is narrated by an eternal ghost spirit that possessed someone at one point in the book and is just floating over everything. And when we first get introduced to that, I was like, that's fucking awesome, finally an interesting moment. And the first 10 pages of part 3 are interesting when it sets that up and it goes, you're listening to a fucking spirit right now. And I was like, that's very cool, I didn't see that coming. And you read that and you go, wow, sounds cool. Sounds like some thematic detail is going to be in the story. But it could have been narrated by a fucking cauliflower, or a fucking block of wood, or fucking Mick Jagger. It's just an excuse so that the book can be in the third person at the end. Because it falls into talking about the world of the book again and the progression of the plot of the book in an almost identical way to the way it was doing in the first 2 parts, but instead of I, it now says she, and there's no discernible difference because of the way the ghost is talking. There's no change in tone, there's no change in style, there's no change in what the ghost would focus on. It's just the fact that they have a wider viewpoint. It's incredibly insufferable because the fact that it's a ghost doesn't matter. It's the voice of a fucking ghost, and it's just going, and then the plantation owners come, and then they're trying to solve the murder, and then one of the sisters gives a monologue that just explains the themes of the book, and then we're just narrating all this in this very dry style that's almost identical to the first 2 parts of the book. Wow, almost identical. It's so interesting that that these 2 sisters, one mute and one able to talk, sound exactly like an eternal fucking fisherwoman. Wow, that's so interesting. Why have it be a ghost then, if it's just gonna sound the same? What happens is, at the end of part 2, there's an event that happens, and it's the death of someone. And again, kind of spoilers, so don't listen to this if you don't know the book. But the object of the love triangle, the boy Severo, gets killed, and then the book in part 3 deals with the after effect of that from the perspective of that ghost. But again, after the first 10 pages, it just boils down to talking about people in the exact same way that the first 2 girls were talking about it. There's no discernible difference, and I don't know why you do the build-up, and then you cut, and then you act like you're gonna do something different, and then you don't do something different after the first 10 pages. It just goes back into solving what was left in part 2, in part 3. And then when the book ends, it's like, well, what the fuck? Like, this could have just been narrated by a human. Why was it a ghost? It doesn't matter. There is no attempt to utilize viewpoint in this book. Absolutely not. And the fact that it would break itself up was perhaps engaging to people, and it was engaging to me on a superficial sense to go, right, we're breaking up, we're switching viewpoints, this should be interesting, now we're gonna get some more setup. But then it doesn't matter. The delivery of events, the focus, the character work, the detail, it was all the exact same. The only interesting parts in this book to me were the very beginning of the book, the beginning of part 3, and the ending of part 3. That was it. The rest of the book was just following this plot, these women growing up from like beginning to end, and the fact that there is this interesting shit around it, or these like attempts at doing something interesting, just made everything else more frustrating and more bland. Now we can talk about the point of the book, because this was when I kind of realized what the book was trying to do, and I do not feel like the focus on land rights and the rights of workers and the importance of that in the third part when that becomes the main theme, I do not think that was granted the level of thematic relevance in the first two parts. I agree that that's probably deliberate, but in my head, where I was finding everything boring, it came like a bolt of lightning out of nowhere, and I had to really do some thinking to catch up and go, this is what the author was attempting to do or trying to do. And I feel like this is a case that I can forgive because I feel like there's a level of cultural relevance behind this book that I'm not getting because I'm just a white guy reading it on my couch. And so that twist at the end where it moves into, and here's what the book was really about, is something I should love, but I don't because I find the rest of the book boring. If I didn't find the rest of the book boring, I would love it, but I think that if I were a different person, I wouldn't find the rest of the book boring. Does that make sense? Most of that exploration of the workers' rights detail comes from characters within a scene reacting to an event. It doesn't come from the head of the ghost itself. I ask you, if the book was narrated by one of the sisters in part 3, or if it was narrated by some other character, would the themes of the final part, or the delivery of them, change in any meaningful way? And you know, even though you may like the book, you know in your heart of hearts that the answer is no. That would not change. So we can delete the argument that a ghost would just be more interested in workers' rights, and that's why it feels like it comes out of nowhere. It feels like it comes out of nowhere at the end, the discussion of workers' rights. And it wouldn't feel that way if the setup for that in the first two parts, where it shows how these workers live, wasn't so boring and wasn't so reliant on tropes that I knew. The first two parts imply I have to care about characters and their histories specifically, and then the third part is paying that off while bringing in the bigger themes. Like, spoilers, but the Severo kid that dies, I could not give a shit. And the fact that he dies at that part implies that I'm meant to be caring about his character in the first two parts or feeling like he's important, and I was definitely meant to for the transition to work into the third part, but I just didn't, and I wish I could, to be fair, because a lot of the book is, like, well written. It's not a poorly written book. I guess the other critics read a different book to me. I just was not feeling it. The only thing I was thinking of at the end of the book, which has this absolutely awful final line, was, how does all this relate to the kids cutting their tongues out? And I get that it's probably a metaphor for workers' rights being silenced, but the workers' rights as a metaphor was not important in the first two parts of the book. It simply was not. It was in the background, kind of, like it was mentioned every now and again, but I didn't feel this, like, cohesive connection to the first two parts, and all this discussion of a love triangle and, oh, my husband's abusive, oh, now he's dead. How does that relate? Like, fuck off. I get that the idea is that the book moves from this very specific discussion of these two sisters living in their environments to the broader perspective of workers and, like, how they react to a major event in their community. And again, in theory, I should love it, but the fact that the book is doing these interesting things, like people being possessed, taking the voice of a spirit, people cutting their tongues out, and then doing boring shit, was frustrating to me, and I was kind of unwilling at the end to give it the credit it deserved. And the transition was not smooth, and the perspective of a ghost was try-hard. And those are kind of my really dumbed-down thoughts of the book. I feel like that's kind of the easiest way for me to explain it. A lot of the cultural relevance of this book probably went over my head, so that's fine. I'm giving this book a 5 out of 10. I'm kind of giving it the benefit of the doubt in some ways. I'm never gonna read it again. I don't particularly like it, but I get why other people like it, and I would prefer not to take that away from others. And again, the writing of it is good. There aren't any caveats, there aren't really any cringe moments, but the whole book just kind of slid out of my head like a fucking ice flow, and I wish it didn't. As with all books that are boring, I wish it didn't, but it is what it is, and I apologize to people who really love this book. I can see that there's probably things I'm missing, so thank you all, but that's my sort of shit review for this book, and next up we'll be doing what I'd rather not think about, and then after that maybe Kairos or something. We're powering through, but as it stands, Crooked Plow, 5 out of 10. Sorry guys, bye!